Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. One of the strangest and most frightening experiences of my childhood happened when I was around 10 years old. Even now, more than a decade later, my cousins, siblings, and I still talk about it whenever we get together. Every single time the conversation ends the same way. Nobody knows what happened. Nobody has ever found an explanation. And despite all of us witnessing it, the event remains just as confusing today as it was that night. At the time, family gatherings were a regular thing. My grandparents' house was the place where everyone seemed to end up. Birthdays, holidays, weekends, random family visits, it didn't really matter. If enough relatives were free, somehow everyone ended up there. On this particular evening, almost all of the cousins and siblings were together. There were around 10 of us in total. The adults had made plans for a night out. Parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles had gone to dinner, leaving the older kids in charge of the younger ones. To us, it felt like freedom. Whenever the adults left, the atmosphere changed instantly. Rules became more relaxed. The television stayed on longer. Nobody worried about bedtime. We could eat snacks, watch movies, and enjoy having the house mostly to ourselves. That night was no different. We were all gathered in the living room watching movies. Some of us were actually paying attention. Others were talking, laughing, or wandering in and out of the room. It was a completely normal evening. Nothing unusual. Nothing scary. Nothing that gave any indication that something strange was about to happen. Outside, the night was calm. The house sat in a quiet neighborhood. There were no storms, no unusual weather, no loud construction nearby. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Then, it happened. Without warning. 1 second, we were watching television. The next second, the entire house seemed to explode with light and force. A massive flash lit up the back of the house. At the exact same moment, the entire building shook. Not slightly. Not enough to make us wonder if we imagined it. The whole house physically shook. The floor vibrated beneath us. The walls seemed to tremble. The windows rattled. It felt like something enormous had struck nearby. For a split second, nobody moved. I think our brains were trying to understand what had just happened. Then, panic took over. Every single kid in that room reacted at once. People screamed. Someone dropped a bowl of snacks. Several of us jumped to our feet, and like a herd of terrified animals, we all ran. Not outside. Not toward the source. Away from it. We bolted into the hallway in the center of the house. The hallway felt safer somehow. Away from the windows. Away from whatever had caused that flash. I remember standing there with everyone else, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. Everyone was talking at once. What was that? Did you see that? Was that lightning? No way. Did something explode? Nobody knew. The older cousins immediately tried to take control of the situation. At least as much control as teenagers can take during a moment of complete confusion. One of them suggested calling the police. Another thought that might be overreacting. A debate started. Should we call emergency services? Should we wait? Should we check outside? In the end, they decided to call our parents first. That seemed like the safer option. While they made phone calls, the rest of us stayed huddled together. Nobody wanted to be alone. Nobody wanted to go near the back windows. Every little sound suddenly felt threatening. We kept expecting something else to happen. Another flash, another impact, another explosion. But nothing came. The house remained silent. Minutes passed. Slowly, the panic started fading. The longer we stood there, without anything else happening, the more our courage returned. Eventually, curiosity began winning the battle against fear. Someone suggested checking the living room again. Nobody wanted to be the first person to go. But eventually, we all started moving. Very carefully. Very slowly. Like characters in a horror movie making terrible decisions. The funniest part, looking back now, was that we armed ourselves first. Not with anything useful, just random objects grabbed from around the house. Broom handles, flashlights, whatever looked remotely capable of serving as a weapon. At 10 years old, carrying a broomstick somehow made us feel invincible. Together, we returned to the living room. Everything looked normal. The television was still on. The furniture was untouched. Nothing appeared damaged. We cautiously approached the windows. Still nothing. The backyard looked exactly the same as it always had. No crater, no fire, no fallen tree, no broken fence. Nothing. The place where the flash seemed to come from looked completely ordinary. That only made the situation more confusing. If something powerful enough to shake the house had happened, there should have been evidence. At least that's what we thought. Yet there wasn't. Not a single sign. For the next half hour, we stayed alert. Nobody wanted to admit how scared they still were. But everyone kept glancing toward the backyard. Everyone kept listening for unusual sounds. Everyone remained nervous. Eventually, the adults returned home. By then, we were desperate for answers. The moment they walked through the door, everyone started talking at once. We told them about the flash, the shaking, the noise, the panic, the phone calls, everything. The adults listened. Then they looked at each other. Then they looked at us, and somehow seemed completely unconvinced. Several of them went outside to inspect the yard. Nothing. They checked around the house. Nothing. They asked neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. Nothing. No one reported a flash. No one reported an explosion. No one reported any disturbance at all. According to everyone else, the night had been completely normal. That was impossible. At least from our perspective. There were 10 of us. 10 separate people. Every single one of us had seen it. Every single one of us had felt it. Every single one of us had reacted to it. The idea that we had all imagined the exact same thing seemed ridiculous. Yet, there was no evidence proving otherwise. As the years passed, we occasionally tried solving the mystery ourselves. Maybe it was a transformer exploding somewhere nearby. Maybe it was ball lightning. Maybe a meteor. Maybe some strange electrical event. Every theory sounded plausible for a few minutes. Then we remembered one detail or another that didn't fit, and the mystery continued. Now, more than 10 years later, the story still comes up during family gatherings. Usually someone mentions it, and everyone immediately remembers. The conversation always follows the same pattern. Everyone shares what they remember. Everyone agrees it happened. Everyone agrees it was terrifying. And then everyone admits they still have no idea what caused it. I've experienced other scary moments since then. I've dealt with situations that were more dangerous and more serious. But for some reason, this remains one of the creepiest memories from my childhood. Maybe because there was never any explanation. Maybe because every person there witnessed the same thing. Or maybe because, for one brief moment, it genuinely felt like something impossible had happened right outside our house. And after all these years, that mystery still hasn't been solved. There are certain conversations that stay with you forever. Not because they were inspiring, not because they were emotional, and not because they taught you some great lesson about life. They stay with you because they force you to confront something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The reality that some human beings can do terrible things and somehow convince themselves they were justified. Years ago, I worked in a maximum security mental health facility. It wasn't the kind of place most people imagine when they think about hospitals. Many of the patients there weren't simply struggling with mental illness. Some had committed extremely serious crimes, violent crimes, the kinds of crimes that make headlines, the kinds of crimes people talk about for years afterward. Working there exposed me to a side of humanity that most people never see. You learned very quickly that appearances often mean very little. Some of the most dangerous individuals looked completely ordinary. Some were polite. Some were intelligent. Some could carry on a perfectly normal conversation. If you passed them on the street, you would never suspect what they had done. One particular encounter has stayed with me more than any other. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that day. It started like countless other conversations I had during my time there. I sat down across from a patient. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't acting aggressively. He wasn't behaving in a way that would immediately make someone uncomfortable. In fact, he seemed calm, very calm, the kind of calm that makes you lower your guard. We started talking. At first, the conversation felt relatively normal. Then, it took a turn. Gradually, he began talking about his past. Then, he began talking about a woman, his girlfriend. The way he spoke about her immediately caught my attention. There was something unsettling about it. Not anger, not sadness, something else. A strange detachment. As if he were discussing a story he'd heard rather than events he had personally experienced. Then he told me he had killed her. Just like that. No dramatic build-up, no hesitation. Simply stated it as a fact. I remember feeling my stomach tighten. Even working in an environment where violent histories weren't uncommon, hearing someone casually admit to murder was still shocking. But the conversation didn't stop there. He continued, and the details became increasingly disturbing. He described what happened after the killing. He talked about dismembering her body. He talked about cutting her into pieces. Then he described boiling her head. The words themselves were horrifying, but somehow the way he delivered them made it even worse. There was no visible emotion, no remorse, no obvious guilt. He spoke as if he were explaining a household task. Matter of fact, calm, almost conversational. For 45 minutes, I sat there listening. 45 minutes that felt both incredibly long and impossibly short at the same time. Part of me couldn't believe the conversation was happening. Part of me wanted it to end. Another part of me couldn't stop listening. Because every sentence revealed something that felt impossible to understand. The most disturbing part wasn't even the crime itself. As terrible as the crime was, it wasn't what stayed with me afterward. What stayed with me was his reasoning. He genuinely believed he had done the right thing. Not in a manipulative way. Not in the way criminals sometimes try to excuse their actions. He seemed completely sincere. He explained why he thought killing her had been justified. The explanations made no sense. At least not to any reasonable person. The logic was deeply distorted, yet in his mind everything fit together perfectly. At one point he told me something that still sends a chill through me when I think about it. He said he wished he could speak with her parents. For a moment I assumed he meant he wanted to apologize. That would have been the normal assumption. But that wasn't what he meant at all. He wanted to explain himself. He wanted them to understand why he had done it. He genuinely believed that if he could simply explain his reasoning clearly enough, they might agree with him, might understand him, might even see what he had done as something positive. That realization hit me harder than anything else he said, because it revealed just how disconnected his perception of reality had become. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't joking. He wasn't being sarcastic. He truly believed it. As he spoke, I found myself caught between two very different reactions. One was horror, the obvious horror anyone would feel listening to such a story. The other was fascination, not fascination with the crime, fascination with the human mind. How does a person reach a point where something so monstrous feels reasonable? How does someone commit such an act and then genuinely believe they were helping? Those questions haunted me long after the conversation ended. When the 45 minutes were finally over, I walked away feeling strangely exhausted. Not physically tired, mentally exhausted. As if my brain had spent nearly an hour trying to understand something fundamentally impossible to understand. For days afterward, I kept replaying parts of the conversation in my head. Certain phrases, certain details, certain moments where his complete certainty seemed almost more disturbing than the crime itself. Over the years, I've had many unusual experiences working in mental health settings. I've met people with heartbreaking stories. I've met people who frightened me. I've met people whose lives were defined by tragedy. But very few encounters have stayed with me as vividly as that one. Not because it was the most violent story I ever heard, not because it was the most graphic, but because for 45 minutes I sat across from someone who had done something horrific and genuinely believed he was the hero of the story. And that realization was far more unsettling than any horror movie I've ever seen. Because monsters in movies are easy to recognize. Real life is different. Sometimes the most disturbing people don't look frightening at all. Sometimes they sit quietly across from you, speaking in a calm voice, completely convinced that the worst thing they've ever done was actually the right thing. A lot of strange things have happened to me over the years, but very few have stayed with me the way this one has. The reason it still bothers me isn't because it was obviously supernatural. It wasn't because I saw a ghost. It wasn't because anything physically dangerous happened. What bothers me is that no matter how many times I think about it, I still can't come up with a reasonable explanation. Even years later, every detail remains clear in my mind. This happened during the summer when I was staying at my parents' house for the holidays. I had moved away for school and work, so coming back home always felt a little strange. Everything was familiar, yet somehow different. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. My room was still my room. My sister's room was still just down the hallway. Nothing had really changed. But after spending so much time away, returning always felt slightly unusual. On the night this happened, everyone else in the house was asleep. My parents had gone to bed hours earlier. My sister was asleep in her room. The entire house was silent. I, however, was still awake. I've always been a bit of a night owl, and being back home hadn't changed that. I was sitting in my room at my computer, scrolling through random things online, watching videos, wasting time the way people often do when they know they should probably be asleep. I remember checking the clock at one point. It was around 3 in the morning, the kind of hour when everything feels unnaturally quiet. The kind of hour where even small noises seem louder than they should. Outside, there wasn't a sound. Inside, the house felt completely still. Then, my phone rang. The sudden sound nearly made me jump. Nobody expects a phone call at 3 in the morning, especially not while sitting alone in a dark room. I immediately looked at the screen. The caller was my sister. At first, I was confused. Not frightened, just confused. Her room was literally a few steps away from mine. If she needed something, all she had to do was walk down the hallway. She didn't need to call me. That alone felt odd. Still, I assumed she must have had a reason. Maybe she heard something. Maybe she needed help with something. Maybe she didn't want to wake our parents. Whatever the reason, I reached for my phone and answered. But before I could even say hello, the call ended. Just like that. The second I picked up, the connection was gone. I stared at the screen. The call duration was basically nothing. A missed connection. A few seconds at most. I sat there for a moment, wondering what had happened. Then I decided to simply go check on her. Since her room was only down the hallway, it would take less than a minute. I got up from my chair and walked toward her room. The hallway was dark, except for a faint glow coming from one of the windows. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I reached her door, and that's when everything changed. The moment I got close, I heard a scream. Not a startled gasp, not a small scream. A full-blown, terrified scream. The kind that instantly floods your body with adrenaline. I didn't even think. I immediately pushed the door open and rushed inside. My sister was sitting up in bed, absolutely terrified. She was crying, shaking, looking around the room in panic. I quickly scanned every corner, under the desk, near the closet, behind the door. Everywhere there was nobody there. The room was completely empty. No intruder, no stranger. Nothing, just my sister sitting in bed looking terrified. For several moments, neither of us really knew what to say. I kept checking around the room while trying to calm her down. Eventually, she started breathing normally again. The crying slowed, and she was finally able to explain what had happened. According to her, she had been asleep, completely asleep. Then, she suddenly woke up. At first, she wasn't sure why. Then, she realized something was standing next to her bed. A dark shape. A shadow. Something that appeared to be leaning over her. She described it as being only inches away from her face. Close enough that she could feel its presence. Close enough that the sight instantly terrified her. The moment she saw it, she screamed. Then, whatever it was disappeared. As she told me the story, I remembered the phone call. Trying to reassure her, I said something like, "Well, at least you called me." She immediately looked confused. Then she said something that made the situation even stranger. "What do you mean?" I told her about the phone call. I told her she had called me just moments earlier. She shook her head and said she hadn't called anyone. At first, I thought she was joking. Then I realized she was completely serious. She told me she had been asleep right up until she woke up screaming. She hadn't touched her phone. In fact, she said her phone wasn't even in the room. I didn't believe her. Not at first. So we checked. And sure enough, her phone wasn't there. We searched the room. Nothing. Then we went downstairs. There, inside her purse, was her phone. Exactly where she said it would be. The device had been downstairs the entire time. Now I was the confused one, because I knew what I had seen. I pulled out my own phone and opened the call log. There it was, a missed call from my sister. The timestamp matched perfectly, right around 3 in the morning, exactly when I remembered receiving it. I showed her. She looked just as confused as I felt. Then she checked her own phone. Nothing. No outgoing call. No record of any call being made. Nothing at all. The call existed on my phone. It didn't exist on hers. For a long time, we sat there trying to come up with explanations. Maybe a glitch. Maybe some strange network issue. Maybe an accidental call somehow generated by the phone. Maybe, but every explanation seemed incomplete, especially considering the timing. A phone call from my sister moments before she woke up terrified by something she couldn't explain. A call she insisted she never made. A call that appeared in my records, but not hers. The whole thing felt surreal. Eventually, we gave up trying to figure it out. The rest of the night passed quietly. Nobody saw anything else. Nobody heard anything else. Morning came and life returned to normal, yet the memory never completely faded. Years later, I can still picture that night clearly. The dark hallway, the phone ringing at 3 in the morning, my sister screaming, the empty room, and the missed call that shouldn't have existed. I've heard people suggest all sorts of explanations over the years, some completely logical, some completely paranormal. Maybe one of them is right. Maybe there's a perfectly reasonable answer hidden somewhere in technology that I simply don't understand. But no matter what explanation I hear, one fact remains. At 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone received a call from my sister. And according to her, she never made it. To this day, that's the part I still can't explain. One of the most disturbing experiences of my life happened only a week after I became CPR certified. At the time, I was proud of getting the certification. Like most people who take a CPR course, I hoped I would never actually need to use it. You sit through the training, practice on mannequins, learn the steps, pass the course, and then go back to your normal life. Part of you assumes you'll never face a real emergency. I certainly did. A week later, I found out how wrong that assumption was. I was 19 years old and spending the day with a few friends. Halloween was coming up, and we were doing what a lot of broke college-aged people do around that time of year. We were searching thrift stores for costume ideas. Nothing about the day felt unusual. We were laughing, trying on ridiculous outfits, and wasting time. The biggest thing on our minds was finding something funny to wear for Halloween. At one point, I was in one of the dressing rooms trying something on. Then I noticed the atmosphere outside suddenly change. The store had been filled with normal background noise only moments earlier. People talking, shopping carts moving, employees working. Then everything went quiet, not completely silent, but quiet enough that I immediately noticed. I stepped out of the dressing room and heard someone saying that there was a person passed out in the parking lot. People were standing around looking uncertain. Nobody seemed to know what to do. Without really thinking about it, I spoke up. I told them I had CPR certification. Then I told someone to call 911 immediately. At that moment, I still assumed I was going to find someone unconscious. Maybe someone who had fainted. Maybe someone having a medical emergency. Something serious, sure, but manageable. I walked outside expecting that. Instead, I found something very different. At first, I couldn't even locate the person everyone was talking about. The parking lot looked normal. There was nobody lying on the ground. I started looking around when someone yelled that the person was actually inside a car parked far away from the rest of the vehicles. The car sat by itself near the edge of the lot. I immediately started running toward it. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Even before I reached the vehicle, I knew something was terribly wrong. When I looked through the window, I froze for a moment. The woman was slumped against the driver's side window, completely motionless. Her skin had turned a deep bluish color. Her face looked wrong. Not sleeping. Not unconscious. Wrong, I remember feeling panic hit me all at once. Every CPR class in the world cannot prepare you for the first time you see someone who appears to already be dead. She looked young, far younger than I would have expected. The thing I remember most clearly was her face. She had dark rings around her eyes, the kind often associated with severe drug use. But even those had taken on a bluish color from lack of oxygen. Everything about her appearance screamed that she had been deprived of air for far too long. A few of us opened the car door. The moment the door swung open, I got a better look. That was when I noticed something that has stayed with me ever since. There were tears on her face. Actual tears. Tracks running down her cheeks. For some reason, that detail affected me more than almost anything else. Even now, years later, I can still picture it. Someone checked for a pulse. There was uncertainty. Nobody was confident in what they felt. So we repositioned her and checked again. Nothing, or at least nothing that any of us could identify. Still, there was no question about what needed to happen. We pulled her out of the vehicle and laid her on the pavement. Then we started CPR. I remember how surreal it felt. 1 week earlier, I had been practicing on a plastic training dummy. Now I was kneeling on asphalt, trying to save a real person's life. Everything felt unreal. The parking lot, the people watching, the panic, the pressure. I focused on the procedure because there wasn't time to think about anything else. Fortunately, emergency services arrived incredibly quickly. It couldn't have been more than a minute after we started. Maybe less. The ambulance pulled in, and suddenly, the scene transformed. Professionals took over. The paramedics moved fast, very fast. Within seconds, they were working on her. They got equipment out, moved her onto a stretcher, continued resuscitation efforts. Another ambulance arrived shortly afterward. More EMTs joined. At one point, there were several of them surrounding her. Everyone working at once, everyone trying to do something. Anything. A police officer eventually spoke with some of us who had been helping. He explained that they had administered a medication used to reverse opioid overdoses if given in time. Today, most people know it as Narcan. At the time, I wasn't familiar with it. The officer explained that it can sometimes bring someone back if treatment is started quickly enough. Then, he looked toward the ambulance. His expression said everything. He told us she had likely been without oxygen for too long. They would continue doing everything they could until reaching the hospital. But the outcome didn't look good. I remember standing there feeling helpless, watching all these trained professionals fight for someone who was probably already gone, knowing there was nothing more I could do. While everything was happening, I also noticed the inside of her car. There were needles scattered on the floor, empty pill bottles, evidence of a life that had clearly been struggling for a long time. Then there were the other things, the things that somehow made the situation even sadder. A car seat, children's toys, little reminders that there were likely kids involved somewhere in this story. There were also 2 names tattooed on her body. I don't know who those names belong to. Children, family members, someone she loved, I'll never know. But seeing them made her feel less like a stranger, less like a victim, less like a statistic. She became a real person, someone who had relationships, someone who had people who cared about her, someone whose absence would leave a hole in someone else's life. That realization hit hard. The entire experience stayed with me for a long time afterward, not because of the CPR itself, not because of the emergency response, but because it was my first real encounter with death, or at least the process of it. At 19 years old, I had never been that close to it before. I had never looked into the face of someone who seemed to be slipping away. I had never felt the weight of trying to help while knowing it might already be too late. Years later, I still think about that woman sometimes. I think about the tears on her face. I think about the toys in the car. I think about the names tattooed on her skin. And I think about how quickly an ordinary afternoon searching for Halloween costumes turned into one of the most unforgettable moments of my life. Looking back now, I realize there was probably nothing more I could have done. The ambulance arrived quickly. The EMTs acted immediately. Everyone responded as fast as possible. But sometimes that knowledge doesn't make the memory any easier, because some experiences stay with you forever. And that afternoon in the thrift store parking lot is one of them. My grandmother told this story for the rest of her life. No matter how many years passed, no matter who asked about it, she never changed a single detail. She believed every word of it until the day she died. Whether it was a ghost, an angel, a dream, or simply a strange coincidence, nobody could ever convince her otherwise. The story took place during World War II. London was a dangerous place to live at the time. Air raid sirens were part of everyday life. People went to sleep wondering if they would wake up to find their streets still standing. Bomb shelters filled nightly. Entire neighborhoods disappeared overnight. Nobody felt truly safe. My grandmother was living through all of it while caring for my father, who was just a baby. Life was already difficult enough. Then one night, it became even worse. A bombing raid destroyed her home. Like countless other families during the war, she suddenly found herself with nowhere to live. Fortunately, a friend took her in. The friend offered her a place to stay until she could get back on her feet. It wasn't ideal, but during wartime, people helped each other whenever they could. The friend's house had several floors, and because space was limited, my grandmother and baby dad were given a room at the very top of the house. The room wasn't large, but it was warm and dry. That was enough. For a while, life settled into a routine. The war continued outside. The sirens still sounded. The bombers still came. But inside the house, they tried to live as normally as possible. Then came the night my grandmother never forgot. It started like any other evening. The house was quiet. My father was tired. My grandmother picked him up and began carrying him upstairs to bed. She started climbing the staircase toward the room they had been sleeping in. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing felt wrong. Then, according to her, something happened that she could never explain. As she reached the stairs, a figure appeared. Not at the top, not at the bottom, on the staircase itself. She always described it as materializing right in front of her. One moment, there was nothing there. The next moment, someone was standing in her path. She never gave a particularly detailed description, only that it was a figure, a presence, something human-shaped, something impossible. The figure looked directly at her, then spoke. The message was simple. Do not sleep in that room tonight. That was it. No explanation, no warning beyond those words, no dramatic speech, just a clear instruction. Do not sleep in that room tonight. My grandmother said she felt immediate terror, not confusion, not curiosity, pure certainty that she needed to listen. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She didn't continue upstairs. She turned around immediately, picked up what little courage she had left, and went straight back downstairs. When she reached her friend, she announced that she and the baby would not be sleeping upstairs that night. Her friend wasn't pleased. Space was already limited. The arrangements had already been made. The sitting room wasn't meant to be used as a bedroom. Naturally, the friend wanted an explanation. My grandmother either couldn't explain it or didn't want to. How do you tell someone that a mysterious figure appeared on the staircase and warned you away from a room? The story sounds unbelievable even now. Eventually, after some disagreement, the friend reluctantly agreed. My grandmother carried my father into the sitting room. She made up a temporary sleeping area. The baby's cot remained upstairs. Everything else stayed exactly where it was. The room looked unchanged, ready for another ordinary night. Then, darkness came. Sometime during the night, another bombing raid struck the area. By that point, people in London had become accustomed to explosions in the distance. But this one came dangerously close. A bomb detonated near the house. The blast shook the building. Windows shattered, walls cracked, and part of the roof collapsed. When morning arrived and the dust settled, the damage became clear. The upper floor had taken a direct hit from falling debris. The roof had caved inward. Wood, bricks, rubble, everything crashed into the room where my grandmother and my father had been sleeping. Most terrifying of all, the collapse happened directly above the baby's cot, the very place where my father would have been lying if she had followed her normal routine. The cot was crushed beneath the wreckage. Had he been there, he almost certainly would have died. The realization hit everyone at once. If she had gone upstairs that night, the outcome could have been devastating. Instead, she had listened to a warning that she could never explain. For the rest of her life, she remained absolutely convinced that something had intervened. Something had appeared on that staircase. Something had known what was coming. Whether others believed her didn't matter. She had seen it. She had heard it. And because she listened, her baby survived. Over the years, family members debated the story countless times. Some believed it completely. Others searched for rational explanations. Perhaps she had sensed danger subconsciously. Perhaps exhaustion and stress from wartime conditions had caused a vivid hallucination. Perhaps it was simply an extraordinary coincidence. All of those explanations are possible. But none of them ever changed her mind. Whenever the story came up, she told it the same way. The same staircase, the same figure, the same warning, the same bomb, and the same crushed cot. By the time she reached the end of the story, she would usually become quiet. Because no matter how many decades had passed, she never forgot what she saw that night. And she never forgot how close she came to losing her son. Whether it was fate, luck, intuition, or something far stranger, one thing was undeniable. If she had climbed those stairs and gone to bed as planned, my father would likely never have lived long enough for me to hear the story at all. This happened back in 2004 when I was 17 years old. Looking back now, I can confidently say I was lucky to make it through that night unharmed. At the time, though, I didn't fully understand how dangerous the situation was until it was already happening. I had grown up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, the kind of place where people leave doors unlocked and recognize every face they pass on the street. Crime existed, of course, but it always felt like something that happened somewhere else, somewhere far away. Then I moved to the city for college. Everything felt new. The buildings were bigger. The streets were busier. The crowds were larger than anything I had ever experienced. I loved the independence that came with it. For the first time in my life, I could go wherever I wanted without asking permission. Unfortunately, independence and common sense don't always arrive at the same time. One night I learned that lesson the hard way. It was around 1:30 in the morning. I had been out and decided to walk back to my dorm. At the time, the decision seemed completely reasonable. I was young, confident, and honestly, pretty naive. I didn't know the city very well yet, but I convinced myself I could easily find my way back. After all, how hard could it be? The answer, as it turned out, was very hard. Within a short time, I realized I had no idea where I was. The streets looked unfamiliar. The landmarks I thought I recognized disappeared. Every turn seemed to make things worse. At first, I wasn't worried. I figured I'd eventually stumble onto a familiar road. Instead, I wandered into one of the worst parts of the city. Even now, I can remember how unsettling the neighborhood felt. Most of the streetlights were broken. Large sections of the road were swallowed by darkness. Trash covered the sidewalks. Several buildings looked abandoned. The row houses lining the street were in terrible condition. Many appeared to be falling apart. From inside, some of them came shouting. Arguments, the sound of people screaming at each other. The entire area felt tense, hostile, like somewhere you definitely didn't want to be alone, especially not as a 17-year-old girl who had absolutely no idea where she was. At that point, I was already scared, not panicked, but scared enough that I wanted to get out of the area as quickly as possible. Then I heard a car behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. A vehicle was slowly approaching. Nothing unusual about that, at least not at first. But instead of passing me, the car slowed down. Then it slowed even more. Soon it was moving at almost the exact same speed I was walking, keeping pace with me. My stomach immediately tightened. I tried telling myself it was nothing. Maybe they were looking for an address. Maybe they were lost. Maybe I was overreacting. Then I looked inside. There were 5 men in the vehicle. Every instinct I had immediately started screaming that something was wrong. They weren't talking to each other. They weren't paying attention to the road. They were watching me. The car continued creeping alongside me. 1 house, 2 houses, half a block, nearly an entire block. Every second felt longer than the one before. I tried not to look at them. I tried not to panic. But fear was building rapidly. I remember wishing there were other people around. Anyone, a pedestrian, a store owner, a police officer. Instead, the street felt deserted. The only movement came from that car. As I continued walking, I approached an intersection. For a brief moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe they would continue straight. Maybe they would leave. Instead, the car suddenly turned left. My heart jumped. Then it pulled directly into the street ahead of me and stopped, right in my path. I still remember the feeling that hit me in that moment. Pure terror, not nervousness, not anxiety. Terror, the kind that empties your mind completely. Everything inside me froze. I stopped walking. The car sat there, the engine running, 5 men inside, and me standing alone in the middle of the street. Looking back, people often ask why I didn't run. The truth is simple. Fear shut my brain down. I wasn't thinking strategically. I wasn't calculating escape routes. I wasn't planning anything. I was terrified, completely overwhelmed. I genuinely believed that if I ran, they would catch me within seconds. So I just stood there, frozen. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe a few seconds. Maybe a minute. Fear has a strange way of stretching time. It felt much longer. Then, something happened. A porch light suddenly turned on. A house just beyond the parked car lit up. The front door opened. A man casually stepped outside, carrying a bag of trash. That's all he was doing, taking out the trash. A completely ordinary activity. Yet the effect was immediate. The car peeled away, instantly. No hesitation, no delay. One moment it was blocking the road. The next moment it was speeding away. Within seconds, it disappeared into the darkness. The relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. As soon as the danger vanished, every emotion I'd been holding back exploded. I started crying, shaking, trying and failing to pull myself together. The man carrying the trash noticed me almost immediately. To his credit, he didn't ignore me. He walked over and asked what was wrong. I tried explaining. At least I think I did. Honestly, I was crying so hard that I doubt anything I said made much sense. Somehow, he pieced together enough of the story to understand that I was terrified and alone. Instead of brushing me off, he helped. He invited me inside where it was safe, gave me a soda, let me calm down. His roommate joined us shortly afterward. Both of them were incredibly kind, patient, understanding, the exact type of people you hope to encounter during a crisis. Once I had settled down enough to think clearly again, they insisted on walking me back to my dorm, not pointing me in the right direction, actually walking me there. making sure I got back safely. Along the way, we talked a little. I learned they were aspiring stand-up comedians. They even invited me to come watch one of their shows sometime. Unfortunately, I was too young to get into the bars where they performed, so I never got the chance. After that night, I never saw either of them again. I don't remember their names. I don't know what happened to them. I couldn't pick them out of a crowd today. But I've never forgotten what they did for me. Because the truth is, I honestly believe they saved me. Maybe those men in the car intended to do something terrible. Maybe they didn't. I'll never know. But I do know how vulnerable I was. I know how isolated that street felt. And I know that the moment another adult appeared, they left immediately. That's always stayed with me. Sometimes I think about how random the entire thing was. What if that guy hadn't decided to take out the trash right then? What if he'd waited 5 more minutes? What if he'd already gone to bed? One tiny decision on his part may have completely changed the direction of my life. Looking back now, I fully admit I made an incredibly stupid choice that night. Walking alone through an unfamiliar city at 1:30 in the morning was reckless. I was young, inexperienced, and far too confident. I learned a valuable lesson. Thankfully, I got the chance to learn it. Because if one stranger hadn't stepped onto his porch at exactly the right moment, that story could have ended very differently. And every now and then, I still find myself wondering about those two comedians. I hope life treated them well. Because whether they realize it or not, they became the heroes of the scariest night of my life. My mother told me this story years after it happened. Even now, it's one of the few stories that genuinely gives me chills whenever I think about it. What makes it so unsettling isn't just what supposedly happened, it's who the story came from. My family has never been the type to believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything paranormal. Nobody in my family goes looking for haunted houses. Nobody tells ghost stories around campfires. Whenever strange stories came up, there was usually a logical explanation waiting somewhere in the background. That's why this particular story has always stuck with me. Because the people involved weren't the sort of people who would make something like this up. The story centers around my cousin. About 10 years ago, she was 17 or 18 years old. She was young, full of energy, and loved by everyone in the family, especially my aunt and her children. She spent a lot of time at their house. She babysat their kids constantly. The children absolutely adored her. She wasn't just a cousin to them. She was part babysitter, part older sister, and part best friend. Whenever she came over, the kids were excited. She was simply one of those people everyone enjoyed having around. Then, tragedy struck. She was involved in a serious car accident. At first, there was hope. She survived the crash itself and was taken to the hospital. The family spent days hoping she would recover. Days turned into weeks. Everyone waited for good news. Instead, the news they feared eventually came. A couple of weeks after the accident, she passed away in the hospital. The loss devastated the family. She was so young, the kind of loss that never feels fair, the kind that leaves people asking why. While all of this was happening, my aunt's house was undergoing construction work. Renovations had already started before the accident. Builders and contractors were coming and going almost every day. The work continued even after my cousin's death. Life, unfortunately, doesn't stop for grief. Construction schedules don't pause. Bills still have to be paid. Projects still move forward. So the workers remained at the property, continuing the job. A few weeks after my cousin passed away, something strange began happening, at least according to the construction workers. One day, my aunt received a phone call while she was at work. The call came from one of the men working on the house. At first, she assumed it was related to the construction, maybe a question about materials, maybe a delay. maybe a problem with the project. Instead, the worker sounded frustrated. He complained that there was a teenage girl repeatedly showing up at the property. According to him, she would walk around the site without speaking to anyone. She wasn't causing damage. She wasn't bothering the workers. But she kept appearing. Over and over again. The man explained that this had been happening for weeks. The girl would show up unexpectedly, wander around the construction area for a while, and then disappear. The workers found it strange, eventually strange enough that they decided to mention it. My aunt was confused. She didn't know of any local teenager who would be hanging around the property that often, so she asked for a description. At first, it was simply an attempt to identify the girl. Maybe she was a neighbor, maybe a friend of one of the children, maybe someone from the area. The workers started describing her. Long brown hair, a red baseball cap, denim dungarees, a white jacket. The moment he finished describing her, my aunt reportedly felt her stomach drop. Because every single detail matched my cousin. Not just generally, exactly. The hairstyle, the clothes, the appearance, everything. Those were clothes my cousin regularly wore. The description was so specific that it immediately brought her to mind. Still, my aunt tried to remain rational. Maybe it was someone who looked similar. Maybe the workers were mistaken. Maybe it was an odd coincidence. When she got home later that day, she decided to test it. She found a photograph of my cousin and showed it to the construction workers. Without telling them why, without giving them any hints. She simply asked if the person in the photo was the girl they had been seeing around the property. According to the story, every one of them immediately identified her. They all agreed. That was the girl. The same one they had been seeing walking around the construction site. The same girl who had appeared multiple times over several weeks. The same girl they had assumed was simply a local teenager. The problem, of course, was that she had already been dead for weeks. The workers had never known her. They had never met her before. They had no reason to recognize her. Yet, according to them, they had been seeing her regularly, walking around the property as if nothing had happened. The story spread through the family fairly quickly. Most people didn't know what to make of it. Some believed it completely. Others searched for logical explanations. Perhaps there was another girl who looked remarkably similar. Perhaps memories became distorted after learning about the tragedy. Perhaps details changed as the story was retold. All of those explanations are possible. Maybe one of them is even correct. But what has always stayed with me is the timing. My cousin had spent so much of her life at that house. She loved those kids. She helped care for them. She was there constantly. Then, shortly after her death, multiple workers claimed they kept seeing a teenage girl wandering around the property. A girl dressed exactly the way my cousin often dressed. A girl they later identified from a photograph. Whether it was a misunderstanding, a coincidence, or something stranger, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that when my mother told me the story, it genuinely unsettled me. Not because I immediately believed it was paranormal, but because it came from people who normally wouldn't believe such things themselves. My family has never been known for ghost stories. We've never had a history of unexplained experiences. That's what makes this one stand out. Years later, whenever the story comes up, nobody argues about what the workers reported seeing. The only thing anyone disagrees about is why they saw it. And after all this time, nobody has managed to come up with an answer that satisfies everyone. So the story remains. A family mystery. A strange encounter that happened shortly after a young woman died, and one that still gives me chills every time I hear it. When I was in high school, I had a close friend who lived in one of the older neighborhoods in town. The area was actually pretty nice. Large trees lined the streets. Most of the houses had been built decades earlier and had a lot of character. It was the kind of neighborhood where families usually stayed for years, except for one house. The house directly next door to my friend's always seemed empty. People moved in. Then, a few months later, they moved out. Sometimes it happened so suddenly that nobody even realized they were leaving until a moving truck appeared or the house was empty again. There were rumors, of course. There always are when something strange keeps happening. People would talk about how nobody stayed there longer than 6 months, how families would leave in the middle of the night without saying goodbye, how the house always ended up back on the market. At the time, we were teenagers. Teenagers don't hear stories like that and decide to stay away. They decide to investigate. One evening, my friend and I were hanging out with absolutely nothing to do. The boredom eventually led to what seemed like a great idea at the time. We should explore the empty house. Looking back, it was an incredibly stupid idea. At the time, it sounded exciting. The house had been sitting vacant for a while. No lights, no cars, no signs of anyone living there. My friend knew the property well enough to know there was a dog door around back. He was skinny enough to squeeze through it. So, after dark, we quietly made our way into the backyard. The neighborhood was silent. Most people were asleep. The house itself looked even stranger at night. Dark windows, stillness, the kind of silence that makes every little noise seem louder. My friend crawled through the dog door and disappeared inside. A minute later, I heard the back door unlock. He opened it and waved me in. The moment I stepped inside, I remember feeling slightly disappointed. The house wasn't creepy. Not at first. It looked completely normal. Honestly, it was kind of nice. It had probably been built sometime in the 1950s. The architecture had that classic craftsman style you don't see much anymore. The rooms were spacious. The woodwork looked expensive. There was nothing that screamed haunted house, nothing that felt dangerous. The electricity had been turned off, but enough light filtered through the windows that we could still see, especially near the kitchen. The kitchen was actually my favorite part. There was a built-in breakfast nook positioned beside a large picture window. Even in the darkness, you could tell someone had once put a lot of care into designing the house. Outside, a nearby streetlight cast a faint glow through the glass. It was enough to illuminate part of the room. My friend and I wandered around for a while, opening doors, looking into empty rooms, making jokes, acting exactly like two teenagers exploring a place they shouldn't be. Eventually, we ended up sitting in the kitchen. For some reason, we sat on the floor across from the breakfast table. I honestly have no idea why. Maybe we were tired. Maybe we were just enjoying the thrill of being somewhere forbidden. Whatever the reason, we sat there talking. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt wrong. The house remained quiet. The conversation flowed normally. Then, everything changed, without warning. 1 second, I was talking. The next second, my friend screamed. Not a startled yelp, not a laugh, a genuine scream, the kind that comes from pure fear. Before I could even react, something happened to me. My vision vanished. Completely, instantly. It wasn't like turning off a light. It wasn't like closing my eyes. It felt different. The darkness seemed physical somehow, as if it had substance, as if something had wrapped itself around my head. I couldn't see anything, nothing. At the exact same moment, an overwhelming coldness spread through my body. It started at the top of my head and moved downward. Neck, shoulders, chest, arms, legs, every part of me became freezing cold. Not winter cold, not standing outside in December cold. This felt unnatural. Heavy, sickly. The closest thing I can compare it to is stepping into icy water while already exhausted, except it surrounded me completely. The sensation was so intense that I immediately started screaming. I had no idea what was happening. I couldn't see. I couldn't understand what was going on. I just knew something was terribly wrong. Then I felt a hand grab mine, my friend's hand. He grabbed me hard enough that it almost hurt. Then he started pulling. Fast, I stumbled after him blindly, still screaming, still unable to see, still trapped inside that horrible coldness. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, I allowed him to drag me. Then slowly, something changed. The darkness began lifting. Shapes returned. Light returned. My vision started coming back. At the same time, the coldness began fading. Gradually, like thawing after being frozen, I blinked repeatedly, trying to focus, trying to understand where I was. That's when I realized we were outside, standing beneath a streetlight, back on the sidewalk, far away from the house. The strange thing was that it was December. The air outside should have felt colder than inside the house. Instead, the outside air felt warm, comfortably warm, compared to whatever I had experienced in that kitchen. I stood there breathing heavily, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of everything. Eventually, I looked at my friend. His face immediately made things worse, because he looked terrified, not confused, not concerned. Terrified, the kind of terrified you don't fake. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the obvious question. What happened? The answer still gives me chills. He told me that while I was talking, something appeared beneath the breakfast table. Not someone. Something, according to him, a black figure crawled out from underneath. A shape that vaguely resembled a girl. Not clearly human, not clearly anything. Just a dark form. He described it as being completely black, darker than the darkness around it. A shape with no details, no face, no features, just the rough outline of a girl. Then, according to him, it crawled toward me and climbed on top of me. The moment it touched me, I apparently stopped responding. He said my eyes were open wide, but I was groping around blindly as if I couldn't see. That's when he screamed. And when I started screaming, too. The sight had frightened him so badly that he immediately grabbed me and dragged me out of the house. He didn't stop until we were outside, standing beneath the streetlight. Safe, or at least safer. I remember listening to him and feeling completely numb. Part of me wanted to laugh it off. Part of me wanted to dismiss it. But the problem was that I couldn't explain what had happened to me either. I knew what I had felt. The darkness, the coldness, the overwhelming sense of something being terribly wrong. Those sensations were real. Whether there was a paranormal explanation or not, I experienced something. And so did he. Years have passed since that night. My friend and I are still close. Every now and then the story comes up, usually during conversations about strange experiences. And every single time, the details remain exactly the same. Neither of us remembers it differently. Neither of us has changed the story. The consistency is almost as unsettling as the experience itself. I still don't know what happened in that house. Maybe there was a rational explanation. Maybe fear caused some strange psychological reaction. Maybe we scared ourselves. Maybe. But I've never felt anything remotely similar before or since. I've never experienced that kind of darkness. I've never experienced that kind of cold. It felt tangible, almost sticky, like it had weight. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I thought about the house, I felt uneasy. Every time I drove past it, my stomach tightened. Eventually, I stopped walking down that side of the street entirely. Even now, years later, remembering it still sends chills down my spine. Because whether it was paranormal or not, one thing remains true. For a few terrifying moments inside that empty house, I experienced something that I still cannot explain. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to. This story is 100% true. I'm 23 now, but it happened about 10 years ago when I was 13 or 14. Even after all this time, I still remember every detail. Some memories fade over the years. This one never did. It was one of those experiences that permanently changes the way you look at strangers. And for years afterward, every time I saw a white pickup truck, my stomach tightened. Back then, my entire life revolved around skateboarding. If I wasn't at school, I was probably skating. My two best friends were Tim and Brandon, and we spent almost every day together. We skated around town, hung out, and basically did what most teenage boys do when they have too much free time and not enough supervision. One afternoon, we had spent several hours skating around town. Eventually, we got tired, hungry, and thirsty. Someone suggested stopping at the local 7-Eleven before heading home. It sounded like a great idea. Since none of us were old enough to drive, we got there the only way we could, on our skateboards. The town itself wasn't huge. Everyone knew everyone. It felt safe. At least safe enough that three teenage boys didn't think twice about skating around by themselves. We bought our drinks and snacks, hung around inside for a few minutes, and then headed back outside. The sun was still up. People were everywhere. Cars moved through the roads. Families were shopping. It felt like a completely ordinary day. Nothing about the situation suggested that it was about to become one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. We walked toward the edge of the parking lot where we needed to cross the highway. Calling it a highway makes it sound busier than it really was. This was a small town. The road wasn't packed with traffic. Still, we had to wait for the light before crossing. As we stood there talking and drinking our sodas, I happened to glance back toward the gas pumps. That's when I noticed him. A man standing beside a white pickup truck. He looked to be somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. At first, there was nothing unusual about him. People buy gas every day. But then I realized he was staring directly at me. Not casually. Not the way people sometimes glance at strangers. He was staring, intensely, the kind of stare that immediately makes you uncomfortable. I remember feeling confused more than anything. I had never seen him before. I had no idea who he was, yet he was looking at me as if he knew me, or hated me, or both. Then things got weird. Without warning, he dropped the gas pump. Just dropped it. Didn't put it away. Didn't finish filling his truck. He immediately climbed into the driver's seat. At first I thought maybe he was in a hurry. Then the truck roared to life, and suddenly he was accelerating directly toward us. For a split second, my brain couldn't process what was happening. Vehicles don't normally charge at people, especially not in broad daylight, especially not in crowded areas. Yet that's exactly what was happening. The truck came straight at us. Fast, very fast. I remember seeing the front grille growing larger and larger. Then, at the last second, he swerved. Barely, the truck missed us. But only just. As it passed, it grazed my arm and knocked my skateboard flying from my hand. The force nearly spun me around. For a moment, I stood there, stunned, trying to understand what had just happened. Beside me, Brandon reacted first. He screamed something like, "What the hell? You fucking dick." At that moment, we still thought maybe the guy was drunk, maybe reckless, maybe insane. What happened next erased all doubt. The truck sped away from us. But instead of leaving, it swung into the parking lot next to the 7-Eleven. Then it turned around and came back, right at us again. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't careless driving. This man was deliberately trying to hit us. I remember seeing him drive through a ditch separating the two parking lots. He didn't care about damaging the truck. He didn't care about anyone watching. His entire focus seemed to be reaching us. That's when survival instinct finally kicked in. The three of us ran. Not jogged, not hurried. Ran as fast as we possibly could. We sprinted across the road and toward the local library several blocks away. Adrenaline flooded my body. Everything became a blur. The sound of traffic, the pounding of feet, the feeling of absolute panic. I remember looking back while running. The truck was still coming, still chasing us. The image of that white truck racing toward three terrified teenagers remains burned into my memory. We kept running, closer and closer to the library. At the time, it seemed like the safest place nearby. Unfortunately, there was one problem. It was Sunday. The library was closed. As we approached, we realized the doors weren't open. That's when everything fell apart. Tim and Brandon headed toward the entrance. I made a different decision. Near the library was a wooded trail. I knew that trail eventually led close to my backyard. Without really thinking, I broke away and ran toward the woods. The decision probably saved me. Or maybe it nearly got me killed. To this day, I don't know. As I reached the edge of the woods, I glanced back. The truck had pulled into the parking lot. The driver jumped out. Even from a distance, I could see his rage. He wasn't giving up. Then I saw him reach into the bed of the truck. What he pulled out, I still can't say for certain. It looked like either a shotgun or a crowbar. I was too far away, too scared. My vision felt blurred from panic. Whatever it was, it looked like a weapon. And that was enough. I turned and ran, faster than I had ever run in my life. Branches whipped past me. Leaves cracked beneath my shoes. Every second, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. Every second, I expected a hand to grab my shoulder. Or worse, I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I ran all the way home. When I finally reached my neighborhood, I was exhausted, terrified, barely able to breathe. Then, something strange happened. My neighbor, who happened to be Tim's father, pulled up beside me. He told me to get in the car immediately. Apparently, everyone was already looking for us. I climbed in, still trying to catch my breath, still not fully understanding what had happened. He drove me to the local video store where Tim's mother worked. When we arrived, I walked inside and saw Tim, Brandon, several police officers, and a room full of worried faces. A minute later, my mother arrived. The moment she saw me, she burst into tears. That's when I learned what everyone else believed. Tim and Brandon had made it to safety, but nobody knew where I was. After I disappeared into the woods, they thought I might have been caught. They genuinely believed I might be dead, or kidnapped, or injured somewhere. My mother had been preparing herself for the worst. Then, Tim told me something that terrified me even more. According to him, after I ran toward the woods, the man followed me. Not them. Me, for the entire run home, I had assumed the guy was chasing my friends. Apparently he wasn't. Apparently he had chosen me. That realization still sends chills through me, because it means I wasn't imagining the danger. I wasn't being paranoid. That man truly wanted me, and I have absolutely no idea why. The police never found him. No arrest, no explanation, nothing. He simply vanished. For years afterward, I couldn't look at a white pickup truck without feeling anxious. Every time I saw one, my mind went right back to that afternoon. The gas station, the highway, the truck charging toward us, the chase, the woods, the weapon. What bothers me most is one detail. The town wasn't empty. There were people everywhere. Cars, shoppers, families, witnesses. At least 100 people could probably see portions of what was happening. Yet in my memory, I felt completely alone, running for my life while the world continued moving around me. Nobody stepping in, nobody stopping him, nobody knowing how terrified three teenage boys really were. And the strangest part of all, we never did anything to provoke him. We didn't know him. We didn't talk to him. We didn't prank him. We didn't damage anything. We were just three kids trying to walk home after buying drinks. For reasons I'll probably never understand, something about us triggered him. Or maybe something about me did. 10 years later, I still don't know. And honestly, that uncertainty is almost as frightening as the chase itself. Because somewhere out there was a man willing to run down three children in broad daylight. And he was never caught. I've rewritten it in your requested style. Simple English, smooth flow, emotional storytelling. No headings, no bold text, and expanded significantly while staying close to the original story. This is one of those family stories that nobody has ever been able to explain. Even after all these years, every person involved tells it the exact same way. Whether you believe in ghosts, coincidences, imaginary friends, or something else entirely, it's still one of the strangest things that has ever happened in my family. The story actually begins when my sister was very young. Like a lot of children, she had an imaginary friend. At least that's what everyone assumed at the time. She was probably 3 or 4 years old when she first started talking about her. The friend's name was E.E. Nobody knew where the name came from. My sister simply insisted that was her name. According to my sister, E.E. was an older woman, not a child, not a playmate her own age. An older lady. She was kind, friendly, and apparently spent a lot of time with my sister. My sister would talk to her, play with her, tell stories about her. All the normal things parents expect when a child has an imaginary friend. Nobody thought much about it. Kids imagine things. Kids create entire worlds inside their heads. It's part of growing up. So my parents smiled, listened politely, and assumed it would eventually pass. And it did. By the time my sister was around 4 years old, E.E. simply disappeared from her life. The conversation stopped. The stories stopped. The imaginary friend faded away. As far as everyone was concerned, that chapter was over. Life moved on. Several years passed. Then something happened that brought E.E. back into the picture. My sister was around 10 years old at the time. We shared a bedroom back then. It was an ordinary day. Nothing unusual had happened. At some point, my mother received a phone call. My grandfather had taken a turn for the worse at the nursing home. The situation sounded serious enough that my parents immediately left the house. They grabbed their things and rushed out the door. Suddenly, it was just me and my sister at home. I was on the opposite side of the house doing my own thing. My sister was in our room. The house was quiet. Then I heard the radio. At first, I didn't pay much attention. But then it happened again. And again. The radio suddenly clicked on by itself. The volume immediately blasted all the way up. Then it dropped all the way down. Then it shut off. A few seconds later, it happened again. On, maximum volume, minimum volume, off, then again. Exactly the same. At first, I assumed my sister was messing around. That seemed like the obvious explanation. I got annoyed and headed toward our room, intending to tell her to knock it off. As I walked in, I expected to find her standing beside the radio. Instead, she was sitting on her bed, completely frozen. Her face was pale. Not joking around pale. Genuinely frightened. The kind of pale where you instantly know something has scared someone badly. I remember looking at her and then looking at the radio. The room felt strangely quiet. I walked over to the radio, intending to unplug it. The problem was that it wasn't plugged in. I checked. Nothing, no power cord, no batteries, nothing. It shouldn't have been working at all. In fact, it was the only radio in the house. I remember staring at it, trying to figure out what I was missing. Then, I looked back at my sister. Before I could say anything, she spoke. It was E.E. Those words immediately caught my attention. I hadn't heard that name in years. She was shaking, still staring toward the radio. I saw her, she said. It was E.E. At that point, I was completely freaked out. Not because I believed in ghosts, but because my sister looked genuinely terrified, and because I couldn't explain the radio. So I did what most kids would do. I called my mom. I remember being upset and talking too fast, trying to explain what had happened, trying to explain the radio, trying to explain why my sister was so scared. My mother sounded emotional too, far more emotional than usual. That's when she told us something. My grandfather had just died. The timing hit me immediately. The radio incident. My sister suddenly talking about E.E. again. And my grandfather passing away at almost the exact same moment. It felt strange. Very strange. But eventually, life continued. A few days passed. The funeral arrangements were made. Family members traveled in from different places. Everyone gathered together. Like most funerals, it was a sad and emotional time. At some point during the gathering, a relative approached our family. She had been going through old family photographs and found one she thought we might want. She handed it over. The photograph showed my grandparents on their wedding day. It was an old picture, taken decades before either my sister or I were born. The moment my sister saw it, she immediately pointed at the woman in the photograph. Without hesitation, she said, "Hey, it's E.E." The room reportedly went silent, because the woman in the photograph was our grandmother, my mother's mother, the grandmother neither of us had ever met. She had died when my mother was only 11 years old, long before my sister or I existed. There was another detail that made the situation even stranger. We lived in the house where my mother grew up. After our grandmother died, my grandfather eventually remarried. According to the family, our step-grandmother had removed almost all of the old photographs of my mother's mother from the house. By the time we were born, there were no pictures of her displayed anywhere. None. My sister had never seen a photograph of her. At least not that anyone could remember. Yet she immediately identified her as E.E., the same older woman she claimed to have played with as a child. The same woman she said she saw standing in our room years later. The same woman she associated with the strange radio incident on the day our grandfather died. To this day, nobody in the family fully agrees on what happened. Some think it was coincidence. Some think my sister may have somehow seen an old photograph years earlier and forgotten about it. Others aren't so sure. The story has been told countless times over the years. The details never really change. The imaginary friend, the name E.E., the radio, the timing of my grandfather's death, and the photograph. Personally, I don't know what to believe. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe there isn't. But I do know one thing. The look on my sister's face when she saw that photograph wasn't confusion. It wasn't uncertainty. It wasn't someone trying to make a connection. It was instant recognition, as if she was looking at someone she already knew. And after all these years, that's still the part of the story that gives me chills. When I was growing up, my family lived in one of the strangest houses I've ever seen. Even now, years later, I've never come across another house quite like it. It wasn't large. In fact, it was surprisingly narrow. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like an attached townhouse that had somehow broken free from its neighbors and wandered off on its own. It stood alone, tall and skinny, squeezed upward rather than outward. Despite its small footprint, it had 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. Every part of it felt unusual. The house was filled with odd little features that made no sense, but somehow added to its charm. There were 2 fully functioning fireplaces, not decorative ones, actual working fireplaces. The basement contained a shower stall right in the middle of the room for reasons nobody could ever explain. The backyard was so tiny that you couldn't take more than a few steps before running into a fence. And then there was the dumbwaiter. An honest-to-God rope-operated dumbwaiter. It connected the kitchen to my bedroom upstairs. Whenever my parents wanted to send something up, they could literally place it inside and pull a rope. As a kid, I thought it was the greatest thing ever. The whole house felt like something designed by people who started with normal architectural plans and then slowly lost their minds halfway through construction. Nothing was where you expected it to be. Every room had some strange surprise. And honestly, I loved it. It felt alive, unique, like a place that had accumulated secrets over generations. Unfortunately, charm doesn't pay repair bills. The house was old, very old, and eventually its age started catching up with it. Things broke constantly. Pipes, electrical systems, structural issues. It seemed like every month another expensive problem appeared. My parents finally reached a point where they couldn't justify pouring more money into it. Reluctantly, they decided it was time to move. I was devastated. I loved that weird little house. But the decision had been made, so we began preparing for the move. As a kid, I handled most of my own packing, or at least my version of packing. In reality, it was mostly organized chaos. Anything small enough got tossed into the dumbwaiter and sent downstairs. Anything involving effort got shoved into my closet. My clothes ended up packed so tightly into that closet that they became a single massive wall of fabric. A giant brick made entirely of shirts, pants, and sweaters. One day I was clearing it out, pulling everything down piece by piece. The process was miserable. Dust everywhere, clothes falling constantly, the usual moving nightmare. Then I noticed something. At the very top of the closet ceiling was a small access panel, an attic entrance. I had lived in that room for years, yet somehow I had never noticed it before. Maybe it had been hidden behind clothes. Maybe I had simply ignored it. Either way, it immediately caught my attention. And like most curious kids, I instantly decided I needed to see what was up there. I climbed onto my mountain of clothing, balanced carefully, reached up, and opened the hatch. That decision led to one of the strangest discoveries of my childhood. I pulled myself upward and peered into the attic. The first thing that struck me was the light, or rather, the lack of darkness. Attics are supposed to be dark. This one wasn't. The space glowed faintly red. As my eyes adjusted, I realized why. Old Christmas lights had been strung throughout the attic. Red ones. The tiny incandescent bulbs cast an eerie glow across everything, not bright enough to illuminate the space fully, just enough to create strange shadows. The whole attic felt like it was lit by dying embers. The second thing I noticed was even stranger. The attic looked lived in. Not recently, but at some point. Someone had clearly spent time there. The insulation had been pushed aside and covered with plastic sheeting. Sections of the floor appeared intentionally cleared. There was an old gurney sitting against one wall. Not a bed, not a cot. A gurney. The kind you'd expect to see in a hospital. It was covered with sleeping bags and old sheets. Nearby sat a rusted mint green refrigerator. The thing looked ancient. Curiosity got the better of me. I plugged it in. To my amazement, it still worked. The motor groaned to life. I remember finding that oddly impressive. An ancient refrigerator hidden in an attic. Of course, none of that was the part that stayed with me. The part that stayed with me came next. The bones. There were bones everywhere. At first, I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. I was still a kid. My understanding of anatomy wasn't exactly advanced, but even a child knows what bones look like. And there were a lot of them. Piles, actual piles, scattered around the center of the attic. Some were small, some were large, some looked old, others looked surprisingly clean. There seemed to be bones from all kinds of animals. At least I assumed they were animals. I never got close enough to inspect them properly. They were simply heaped together in loose clusters. 6 or 7 piles, from what I remember. White shapes stacked atop one another in the strange red glow. It looked wrong, deeply wrong. Then I noticed something else. 2 of the piles had been burned. The bones were blackened, charred, as though someone had deliberately set them on fire. The surrounding walls bore dark smudges and streaks. At first I thought they were random marks. Then I looked closer. They weren't random. Someone had written things there. Messages. Most of them were impossible to read. Time and age had reduced them to smears. But one word appeared more than once. Sorry, the word was written repeatedly in dark bone char markings. Sorry, I remember staring at those words, trying to understand, trying to imagine who would bring bones into an attic, why they would burn them, why they would write apologies on the walls. Nothing made sense. The entire place felt frozen in the middle of some unfinished story, a story I desperately didn't want to know the ending to. At that point, every instinct told me to leave. So I did. I climbed back down, closed the attic hatch, and spent a long time staring at the ceiling, not entirely sure whether what I'd seen was real. Eventually, I told my parents. I don't remember every detail of their reaction, only that adults became involved very quickly. And I wasn't allowed back into the attic afterward. Years have passed since then. I've thought about that attic more times than I can count. I've come up with countless possible explanations. Maybe someone collected animal bones. Maybe it was an eccentric previous owner. Maybe it was an artist, a hunter, a taxidermist, someone with unusual hobbies. Every explanation sounds reasonable until I remember the atmosphere of that place. The red lights, the gurney, the sleeping bags, the refrigerator, the piles of bones, the burned remains, the word sorry written on the walls. And then I remember one final detail. That attic had been directly above my bedroom for 8 years. Every night while I slept, every birthday, every Christmas morning, every storm, every ordinary day of my childhood. That room had been sitting there, silent, hidden, waiting above my head. And somehow I never knew it existed until the very end. I've rewritten it in your requested style. Simple English, smooth flow, emotional storytelling, no headings, no bold text, and expanded significantly while staying close to the original story. When I was younger, my uncle worked a lot of different jobs. He was the kind of person who always found a way to make money. But one thing remained consistent year after year. During the warmer months, and often well into late fall, he painted houses, not as a side hobby, as a real business. He had a truck with the company name painted on the side, ladders strapped to the roof, paint cans and equipment filling the back, business cards, customers, the whole thing. Every now and then, when he got busy, he would call my dad and ask if I could help. I was always happy to do it. The work wasn't particularly difficult, and for a teenager, the pay felt fantastic. Most days were simple. Show up, paint, go home tired, get paid. Nothing exciting ever happened. At least, that's what I thought. One particular year was especially difficult for my uncle. The weather refused to cooperate. It seemed like every other day brought rain, sometimes every day. Painting houses depends heavily on weather conditions. If it's too wet, you can't paint. If it's too cold, you can't paint. Every storm pushed projects further behind schedule. Since my uncle often worked on several houses at once, delays piled up quickly. As a result, I ended up helping more than usual. I didn't mind. The extra money was nice. One job in particular had become a headache. It was a large Victorian house, located in a quiet, older part of town. The kind of house people slow down to admire while driving past. Tall, elegant, full of character. An older couple lived there. The wife was friendly and polite. The husband was an author. Apparently, he spent most of his time writing. Because of all the delays that year, the project dragged on far longer than anyone expected. My uncle hated leaving jobs unfinished. The homeowners had been patient, very patient. But eventually, they started asking when the work would finally be completed. One day, the wife called my uncle directly. She explained that her husband was trying to finish a book. Unfortunately, the scaffolding outside the house kept distracting him. She wasn't rude about it. Quite the opposite. She was extremely polite. She simply asked if there was any way the project could be finished as soon as possible. My uncle felt bad. The weather wasn't his fault, but he still believed in treating customers fairly. So he promised to prioritize the house. He figured we could finish everything within a day or two. That decision changed my life. The day we returned to finish the job remains crystal clear in my memory. It was late fall, oddly warm for the season, but despite the temperature, there was still a chill hanging in the air. Not the kind that makes you shiver, the kind that seems to settle inside you. A coldness that feels deeper than the weather itself. The sky was covered with gray clouds, not storm clouds, just a blanket of dull overcast. Everything looked muted. Colorless, the entire neighborhood felt strangely quiet, almost too quiet. Looking back, it felt like the setting of a mystery novel, the sort of day where something bad is waiting to happen. Of course, at 17 years old, I wasn't thinking any of that. I was just there to paint. When we arrived, my uncle inspected the house. The front had already been completed. Only portions of the back remained unfinished. My uncle was the experienced painter. He handled detailed work and touch-ups. I usually handled the simpler sections. After unloading supplies, he looked at me and asked a question. "Are you afraid of heights?" I hesitated. The honest answer was yes. A little. Not enough to stop me from climbing ladders, but enough to make me uncomfortable. Unfortunately, 17-year-old boys aren't known for admitting things like that. So, I lied. Nope, my uncle smiled. Good, that should have been my warning. A few minutes later, I was climbing scaffolding that stretched all the way to the third floor. Paint cans hung from hooks on my belt. Brushes and tools rattled against my legs. The higher I climbed, the smaller everything below looked. Eventually, I reached the top platform. From up there, I could see most of the neighborhood. Trees swaying gently, gray skies overhead, quiet streets below. I set down my supplies and got to work. For a while, everything felt normal. I painted trim, touched up corners, moved carefully along the platform. The task was repetitive enough that my mind started wandering. The third floor contained a small, oval-shaped window, an unusual little thing, almost decorative. According to the homeowners, the room behind it was the husband's study. It occupied part of the attic space. Apparently, that was where he did most of his writing. Eventually, I reached the section directly above that window. I crouched down, dipped my brush into the paint, then stood back up. As I did, I naturally glanced through the glass and froze. A man stood inside, the husband. He was staring directly at me, not looking. Staring, I remember being startled. The appearance was so sudden that I almost dropped my brush. For a brief second, I laughed nervously, the way people do when they're caught off guard. I smiled at him, a casual smile, the kind strangers exchange every day. He didn't smile back. He didn't react at all. That was what struck me first. His face. I've never seen another face like it. There was absolutely nothing there. No anger, no sadness, no happiness, no curiosity, no embarrassment. Nothing. It was as if every trace of emotion had been removed. A completely empty expression. And yet he never broke eye contact. Not once. Then he raised his hand. At first I didn't understand what I was seeing. The movement was calm, deliberate, slow only. When the object reached his head, did my brain finally catch up. It was a pistol. He had been holding it the entire time, without looking away from me, without changing expression, without saying a word. He pressed it against his head and pulled the trigger. The sound exploded through the quiet afternoon. For a moment, my mind simply stopped working. I couldn't process what I had just witnessed. The image didn't feel real. It felt like something from a movie, something impossible. Yet it had happened right in front of me, only a few feet away. I remember gasping, a tiny scream escaping my throat. Then instinct took over. I stepped backward. Unfortunately, I stepped backward too far. My foot found empty space, and suddenly I was falling. Everything happened incredibly fast. The sky spun, the house vanished from view. The scaffolding disappeared. Then, impact. Luckily for me, a large bush broke most of my fall. Without it, I probably wouldn't be here telling this story. Instead, I escaped with a broken ankle, cuts, bruises, and a body full of pain. My uncle later told me he heard the gunshot and looked up just in time to see me fall from the third story. He genuinely thought I was dead. Honestly, so did I. The physical injuries healed. The broken ankle eventually recovered. The scratches disappeared. The bruises faded. The damage inside my head took much longer. For months afterward, I couldn't stop seeing his face. That empty expression. That complete absence of emotion. I went to counseling. I had nightmares. Loud noises made me jump. Unexpected memories would appear without warning. Even today, years later, I can still see him standing there in that study, watching me. Expressionless, looking back, I understand things a little better. The police later determined that he had been suffering from severe depression. There were marital problems, alcohol problems, professional struggles. He had apparently been battling writer's block for a long time. A terrible combination of factors. None of that excuses what happened, but it explains some of it. The wife moved away shortly afterward. The project was never completed. My uncle never returned to finish the work. As far as I know, nobody ever moved back into the house. Years have passed since then. Yet every time I think about that street, I remember that window. I remember the gray sky, the silence, the coldness in the air. And most of all, I remember that face. Not because it was angry, not because it was frightening, but because it contained absolutely nothing at all. Sometimes I still avoid driving down that road, because a small part of me worries that if I happen to glance into the backyard, I'll look up at that little oval window and see him standing there again, watching, silent, cold, and completely emotionless. I always seem to arrive late whenever people are sharing strange stories. Usually by the time I get there, thousands of comments have already been posted, and anything I write disappears into the crowd. But this is one story I've never been able to forget. Even now, years later, it still gives me chills. I was 13 years old when it happened. My grandmother was dying of cancer. By that point, there was no uncertainty about what was coming. The doctors had done everything they could. The treatments had been exhausted. The family knew she didn't have much time left. She was spending her final days at home. My mother and I moved in temporarily to help take care of her. The atmosphere inside the house during those weeks is difficult to describe. Everything felt suspended, like time itself had slowed down. Nobody talked much about the future because everyone knew what the future held. Instead, we focused on getting through each day, making sure she was comfortable, making sure she wasn't alone. My grandmother had become completely bedridden. She couldn't get up on her own. She couldn't walk. Even moving around in bed was difficult. Every task required assistance. The cancer had taken almost everything from her physically. Seeing someone you love reduced to that state is heartbreaking, especially when you know there's nothing you can do to stop it. As the weeks passed, the house settled into a routine. During the day, there were medications, visitors, and quiet conversations. At night, there was mostly silence. Everyone slept lightly, partly because we were worried about her, partly because nobody ever truly relaxes when a loved one is dying in the next room. Then came the night she died. I remember it clearly. At some point in the early morning, I was asleep in one of the bedrooms. The house was completely dark, completely silent. Then suddenly, my bedroom door opened. My mother rushed inside. The urgency in her voice instantly woke me up. She wasn't panicked exactly, but she was confused, very confused. I sat up and asked what was wrong. What she told me made no sense. She said my grandmother had just entered her room, not spoken, not called out, actually entered the room. According to my mother, she had been asleep when something woke her up. When she opened her eyes, she saw my grandmother standing there. Then, after waking her, my grandmother had turned around and walked away. At the time, neither of us thought anything supernatural was happening. There was no ghost story atmosphere, no sense of paranormal fear. Just concern, pure concern. Because my grandmother couldn't walk. She hadn't been able to walk for a long time. The idea that she was somehow wandering around the house at 3 a.m. seemed impossible. Yet my mother sounded completely convinced that she had just seen her. I remember immediately feeling worried. Maybe my grandmother had somehow gotten out of bed. Maybe she had fallen. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she needed help. Whatever the explanation, we needed to check on her immediately. My mother and I hurried down the hallway. The house felt strangely quiet. I can still remember that silence. The kind of silence that seems heavier than normal. We entered my grandmother's room and instantly knew something was wrong. She wasn't awake. She wasn't sitting up. She wasn't trying to get out of bed. She wasn't moving at all. My grandmother had died. Sometime during those early morning hours, she had quietly passed away. I don't remember much after that. Not clearly. Shock has a way of blurring memories. Phone calls were made. Family members were contacted. People cried. People arrived. The house filled with grief. And like most families dealing with a loss, we focused on what mattered most. Saying goodbye. Remembering her. Supporting one another. Because of everything that followed, nobody really talked about what had happened beforehand. Not then. Not in those first days. It felt insignificant compared to the reality that my grandmother was gone. Life eventually moved forward, as much as life ever does after losing someone. Weeks passed. Months passed. Maybe even years. I honestly don't remember exactly how long. But one day the memory returned to me. I remembered my mother waking me that night. I remembered what she had said. And suddenly I became curious. So I asked her about it. I expected her to confirm the story, maybe add details, maybe explain something I'd forgotten. Instead, she looked confused, completely confused. She had no idea what I was talking about. At first I thought she was joking. Then I realized she genuinely didn't remember. She remembered my grandmother's death, of course. She remembered that terrible night. But she had absolutely no memory of seeing my grandmother standing in her room. No memory of waking me because of it. No memory of telling me that my grandmother had walked into her bedroom. Nothing. I tried explaining exactly what happened. The details. The conversation. Everything. Still nothing. She couldn't recall any of it, not even vaguely. The more we talked about it, the stranger it felt, because I remembered it clearly. Not every detail, but clearly enough to know it happened. I remembered being awakened. I remembered her exact concern. I remembered us running down the hallway together. Those memories felt real. Yet my mother, who was actually at the center of the experience, remembered none of it. To this day, I don't know what happened. Maybe grief affects memory in strange ways. Maybe exhaustion played a role. My mother had been under enormous stress. Maybe she experienced some kind of vivid dream that blended with reality. Maybe my own memories became distorted over time. Those explanations are possible, probably even likely. But every now and then I think back to that night, to the image my mother described. My grandmother standing in the doorway, waking her one final time, then quietly leaving, only for us to discover moments later that she was already gone. Whether there was a rational explanation or not, I can't say. All I know is that decades may pass, and I still don't think I'll ever forget that moment. The dark hallway, the silence, my mother's confused expression, and the strange possibility that somehow my grandmother stopped by to say goodbye before she left. Even now, writing it down gives me chills. I've rewritten it in your requested style: simple English, smooth flow, emotional storytelling, no headings, no bold text, and expanded significantly while staying close to the original story. When I was 8 years old, my family moved from South Florida to a tiny town in North Florida. The change was dramatic. One day I was living in a busy suburban area with traffic, shopping centers, and neighbors everywhere. The next, I was living in a place that felt like it had been pulled straight out of a horror novel. The town was small, really small. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business. The kind of place surrounded by endless woods, dirt roads, and old stories nobody could quite explain. As a kid, I loved it. As an adult, looking back, there were definitely moments that felt unsettling. Over the 15 years my family lived there, plenty of strange things happened. Most of them could probably be explained. Others were harder to dismiss. But one experience stands out above all the others. And strangely enough, it didn't even happen to me. It happened to my sister. At the time, my sister was married and living in a trailer, not too far away. Her husband had been deployed to Afghanistan. Suddenly, she found herself alone with a newborn baby. Anyone who has cared for an infant knows how exhausting it can be. Now imagine doing it completely alone. No spouse, no help at night, no one to share the responsibility. Just endless feedings, sleepless nights, and silence. Eventually, she decided she couldn't take the isolation anymore. So she packed up her things, grabbed the baby, and moved back into my parents' house for a while. The plan was simple: stay there until her husband returned, have some support, get some sleep, help each other out, At first, everything seemed normal. The baby settled in. The family adjusted. Life continued. Then strange things started happening. Nothing dramatic at first, just little things. The first thing my sister noticed was her headboard. Every now and then it would slam against the wall. Not gently. Not like normal movement from rolling over in bed. A hard, sudden bang. At first she ignored it. Old houses make noises. Beds shift. Things happen. But it kept occurring, randomly, without explanation. Still, she didn't think much of it. Then, one night, something happened that bothered her. She woke up suddenly. Not because of a noise, not because of the baby, because she felt someone tickling her. The sensation was strong enough to wake her from sleep. For a few moments, she was completely confused. She looked around the room. Nobody was there. The baby was asleep. The house was quiet. Eventually, she convinced herself it had been a dream. Or maybe a strange, half-awake sensation. Either way, she let it go. Then, things escalated. One night, my mother was sleeping when she was jolted awake by screaming. Not a startled yelp, not someone calling for help. Actual terrified screaming. The kind of scream that immediately tells you something is wrong. My mother jumped out of bed and ran to my sister's room. What she saw there still makes my skin crawl. According to my mother, the entire bed was moving. Not vibrating, not shaking slightly. Moving violently. The mattress bounced. The frame rocked. The whole thing shifted from side to side, up and down, as if someone had grabbed the bed and was trying to throw it across the room. My mother later described it as looking like a boat caught in rough water. The movement was aggressive, powerful, impossible to ignore. My sister sat in the middle of it, completely terrified. Neither of them could explain what was happening. Eventually, it stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. The room became quiet again, still normal, as if nothing had happened. Most people would probably pack up and leave after something like that. My family didn't, partly because they were practical people, partly because life had already thrown enough problems at them. They had been through hardships before. They simply kept going. The strange activity continued. Not every night. Not constantly. Just enough to keep everyone uncomfortable. Then came the incident that frightened my sister more than anything else. One evening, she was sitting in her room feeding her son. The house was quiet. The baby was nursing peacefully. Everything felt normal. Then she felt someone grab her ponytail. At first, it was a light tug. Then it became stronger, much stronger. According to her, something started yanking her hair, pulling her head around. Not once. Repeatedly, as if someone standing behind her was intentionally trying to get her attention. She screamed. My mother rushed into the room. By that point, everyone in the house was exhausted by whatever was happening. Fear had slowly turned into frustration. And instead of panicking, my mother did something unexpected. She stood in the room and spoke out loud, not to my sister, not to the baby, to whatever she believed was causing the disturbances. She spoke the way a teacher speaks to a misbehaving child. Firm, calm, direct. According to my family, she said something very close to this. I understand things are different now. There's a baby here. There has never been a baby here before. You're curious. I understand that. But you will not touch them anymore. You can stay. You can look. You were here, before us. But I swear to God, you are not allowed to touch them. Then she left the room, and according to everyone involved, everything stopped. Completely. No more shaking beds. No more slamming headboards. No more tickling. No more pulling hair. Nothing. The house returned to normal. The baby grew up. My sister eventually moved out. Life continued. To this day, nobody in my family can fully explain what happened. Some people believe stress played a role. My sister was exhausted from caring for a newborn. Everyone was under pressure. Others think there may have been perfectly ordinary explanations that nobody noticed at the time. And then there are those who aren't sure. Because whether you believe in ghosts or not, it's hard to explain why all the activity supposedly ended the moment my mother laid down the rules. Years later, whenever the story comes up, that's the part people always remember. Not the rocking bed, not the tickling, not the pulled ponytail. The fact that my mother walked into the room, spoke to an empty space as though she were disciplining a child, and whatever had been happening never happened again. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. But even now, after all these years, it's still the strangest story my family has ever told. I've rewritten it in your requested style, simple English, smooth flow, emotional storytelling, no headings, no bold text, and expanded significantly while staying close to the original story. I shared this story somewhere else a while ago, but it's still one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. The reason it sticks with me isn't because I've always believed in ghosts. Actually, it's the opposite. I've always been the person who goes looking for explanations. If someone tells me a house is haunted, I want to visit it. If someone claims they saw something supernatural in the woods, I'm usually the first person asking where it happened. I've spent years hearing creepy stories and never finding anything that convinced me. Every strange noise had an explanation. Every shadow turned out to be something ordinary. Every ghost story eventually fell apart. Then, this happened. About a month ago, I went over to my girlfriend's house. I'd been there countless times before. The house was familiar, comfortable. Nothing about it had ever made me feel uneasy. But the moment I walked into the living room that day, something felt wrong. Not dangerous, not terrifying, just wrong. It's difficult to explain. A feeling settled over me almost immediately. A heaviness, anxiety, sadness. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room after an argument and can somehow sense that something happened there. Except there was no obvious reason for it. I tried to ignore it. At first I thought maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd had a stressful day. Maybe I was imagining things. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The longer I sat in that room, the stronger it became. Eventually, I asked if anything had changed. That's when my girlfriend casually mentioned that her family had recently moved a piece of furniture into the living room. A china cabinet. It had belonged to her grandmother. Her grandmother had passed away a few months earlier. The cabinet had been sitting elsewhere in the house before being moved into the living room. The moment she pointed it out, I looked at it and instantly knew that was what had been bothering me. Now, to be clear, I had never met her grandmother, not once. When her grandmother was alive, she had already been bedridden in the hospital. I had no personal connection to her, no emotional attachment, no reason to react strongly to her belongings. Yet standing near that cabinet made me feel uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I told my girlfriend. She laughed it off, said it was probably nothing. And honestly, that was the most logical answer. After all, it was just furniture, a cabinet, nothing more. A few minutes later, she got up to use the bathroom. I remained in the living room. Alone, the cabinet sat against the wall. Tall, dark, almost imposing. It was probably 6 feet high, made of dark wood. The front featured large glass panels. Inside were teacups, decorations, and several small dolls. The back of the cabinet contained mirrors, old-fashioned mirrors that reflected the room behind anyone standing in front of it. For some reason, I found myself walking over to it. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe because I couldn't stop thinking about how uncomfortable it made me feel. I stood there studying the contents. The teacups, the tiny dolls, the reflection staring back at me from the mirror. Then something happened. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, a reflection, something perfectly normal. But as I stared into the mirror, I became convinced I saw someone standing behind me. Not clearly, not enough to identify, just the silhouette of a person. Dark, motionless there for a split second. Then, gone. The sight startled me immediately. I spun around. Nobody was there. The room was empty. For a moment, I stood there trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Then I called out to my girlfriend. I wanted to tell her what I'd just seen, or thought I'd seen. I barely got the words out before I heard a scream. Not from the living room, from the bathroom. A sharp, terrified scream. The kind that instantly makes your blood run cold. I ran toward the bathroom, heart pounding. The scream had sounded genuine, not joking, not playful. Terrified, when I reached the door, it was closed. I started pounding on it, calling her name. As soon as the door opened, I knew something had seriously frightened her. She was sitting on the floor, crying, shaking, completely pale. I immediately asked what happened. It took a moment before she could answer. Then she told me. She had seen someone in the bathroom mirror. The words hit me like a punch, because I hadn't told her about what I'd just seen. Not yet. There hadn't been time. I stood there trying to process what she was saying. Part of me wanted to find a logical explanation. Part of me was desperately searching for one. But at that moment, neither of us wanted to stay in that house long enough to figure it out. We left. Immediately, no shoes, no jackets, no gathering belongings, nothing. We simply walked out the front door and headed straight to my car. Then we drove. For a long time. Neither of us had a destination in mind. We just wanted distance. Distance from the house. Distance from whatever had happened. The drive lasted around an hour. Maybe longer. Eventually, we calmed down enough to return. By then, it was getting late. As we pulled back into the driveway, we noticed someone sitting on the front steps. Her mother. She was waiting outside. The moment we got out of the car, she told us something that made the entire situation even worse. She said she kept seeing shadows moving through the house. Not clearly, not enough to identify anything. Just movement where there shouldn't have been movement. Dark shapes passing through rooms. At that point, nobody wanted to go back inside. Looking back now, I still don't know what happened. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the cabinet triggered something emotionally without us realizing it. Maybe stress, suggestion, and fear combined to create a perfect storm. There are plenty of possible explanations. And normally I'd be the first person arguing for them. That's who I am. I've always chased stories like this. I've gone looking for supposedly haunted houses. I've explored places people swore were cursed. I've listened to stories about creatures in the woods and spent nights searching for evidence. I've never found anything. Not once. Every time there was a reasonable explanation. Every time reality won. But this experience felt different. Not because I can prove anything supernatural happened. I can't. Not because I suddenly became a believer. I didn't. But because for the first time, I experienced something that I couldn't immediately explain away. Something that left me with more questions than answers. And years from now, I suspect that's exactly what I'll remember. Not the cabinet. Not the mirrors. Not even the shadows. I'll remember the feeling. The overwhelming certainty that something wasn't right. and the fact that everyone in that house seemed to feel it at the same time.